Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the presentation that I've titled Nation Branding in Times of Crisis, the Israeli Case Study. What I wanted to talk about this afternoon is to present and define what nation branding really is, to talk about how social media is now used in nation branding campaigns, to touch on the issue of nation branding in times of crisis, and finally summarize with the Israeli case study. So when we talk about nation branding, we're actually talking about the assumption that nations have images, similar to corporate brands. And when we talk about images, we're really talking about cognitive associations, associations that come to mind when we think about a certain country. So for instance, public opinion polls have shown that when people are asked what comes to mind when you think of Switzerland, there are three main associations: dramatic landscapes, fine chocolate, but of course, private banking. When people were asked what comes to mind when you think of Germany, there were three different associations, especially European leadership, German mechanics, and the German history of the Third Reich. Now, if we accept the assumptions that nations do indeed have images, then we may also agree that nations can attempt to manage these images. In other words, to create new associations. So that when you think of Germany, you will think of European leadership, German manufacturing, but also of great food, for instance. And creating new associations is really the end goal of every nation branding campaign. And an interesting example is New Zealand. In the early 1990s, New Zealand decided to manage its national brand, and they tried to understand what people think of when they think of New Zealand, and most people thought of a far away country where there are more sheep than people. And New Zealand wanted to create new associations, and so they focused on three major things. First, dramatic scenery. Second, the land of adventure, which is also the land of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And finally, fine fruit, which is now sent all over the world. And this is when New Zealanders really became known all over the world as Kiwis. And New Zealand, Germany, and other nations are by no means the only ones to have nation branding campaigns. As this slide shows, countries like Argentina, Croatia, Spain, France, Greece, Colombia, Chile, most of the nations around the world today have nation branding campaigns in an attempt to manage their image and the associations that are part of that image. And so now we finally arrive at the definition of what nation branding is, and we can say that nation branding is a process by which a nation's image can be created, monitored, evaluated, and proactively managed in order to improve or enhance the country's reputation among a target international audience. And it's really the application of techniques from the world of marketing and branding to the national brand. This is the definition. But if we look at a few words here, for instance, we said that nation branding is a process by which you can create, monitor, evaluate, and proactively manage the national brand. We begin to see the relevance of social media to nation branding. And indeed, most countries now use social media when they do nation branding campaigns. And that's because what you can achieve through social media. So for instance, by using social media for a nation branding campaign, you can very clearly define who your target audience is. So for instance, Australia might decide to have a nation branding campaign in Israel in order to encourage Israeli youngsters to travel to Australia, say youngsters between the ages of 18 and 25. So they define their target audience, and then using social media, they can tailor content to that specific audience. For instance, with regard to platform, what is the social media platform most used by Israeli youngsters? Are they on Facebook, Twitter, or perhaps Instagram? How do these youngsters perceive Australia already? Do they see it as an exciting place, or do they see it as a boring place? So what's their perception of the country? What language do they use online? Hebrew and English? And even, what are they looking for? Are they looking for a country where they can surf and have fun on the beach, or are they looking for a country where they can do extreme sports? So once you have defined your target audience and tailored content to them, you can create and disseminate a new national portrait. And since we're dealing with social media, you can actually create and disseminate a national selfie that resonates with people. And it's very important, this idea of a selfie that resonates with people, and this picture of an American soldier giving water to his dog is a very good example of how the State Department brands America online. You will never see images of airplanes, soldiers, and war on the American State Department's Twitter page, but mostly of soldiers hugging children and giving water to dogs. And finally, you can actually measure if a change in perception of a country has taken place. You can ask people what they associate with Australia before the campaign, after the campaign, and actually see if you've had a profound impact. Now, why do nations brand themselves? Why do nations attempt to create a positive image? Well, there are three main reasons. The first is the economic incentive. You want a positive image in order to attract foreign direct investments, to have big companies create factories in your country. You want to attract tourism from all over the world, and you even want to attract global brands to your country, to have H&M stores in Israel. Second is to project a positive national image. Countries that have positive images are more likely to succeed in promoting their foreign policy goals. For instance, they're going to have an easier time creating coalitions in the UN and passing UN resolutions. And this idea of projecting a positive national image is manifest these days on the Iranian Twitter channels, as Iran is promoting the WAVE nation branding campaign, which is World Against Violence and Extremism. So it's no longer Iran as a nuclear threat, but Iran as a positive force in the world. And finally, nation branding campaigns may be used to legitimize the use of military power. If your country is seen as a positive country, if your country is seen as one that acts in accordance to accepted norms and values, it will encounter less resistance when it decides to use military force. And that is why, for instance, America on its social media channels always portrays itself as the world moral leader, but also as a benefactor and donator of other countries. And here we have an example of how America is giving electricity to Africa. So it's a positive country, and thus it might encounter less resistance to its military interventions. Now, focusing on Israel. In the early 2000s, Israel also decided to join other nations and have a nation branding campaign. And they started asking people what they associate with Israel. What is the national brand? And they found that people associate Israel with three main things. First, the occupation of the Palestinian people. Second, continuous military escalations and violations of human rights. And Israel decided to take a proactive stand and manage this image, create new associations. And there were actually three pillars of the new Israel national selfie. The first was the startup nation. Israel as a high-tech mecca, as a global hub of innovation and also positive innovation. Israeli companies developing prosthetics for handicapped people. Israeli companies enabling deaf people to hear for the first time, creating artificial limbs. So this is a positive element of Israel. Second, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. In a region populated by tyrants and despots, Israel stands out as the only true democracy. And the third pillar of the brand was the city of Tel Aviv. Unlike Jerusalem, which is politicized and is part of the conflict, Tel Aviv is represented as an open, liberal, and especially gay-friendly city. So this is the new Israeli brand that Israel has been promoting both offline and online. However, the question is, what happens to nation branding campaigns in times of crises? What happens when a crisis and violence erupts, and how does that influence a nation branding campaign? And over the past few months, about half a year, we've been witnessing a very dangerous escalation in violence between Israel and the Palestinians. There are terrorist attacks taking place almost on a daily basis, mostly by individuals, teenagers and women. And what is especially interesting is that these attacks come out of the West Bank. Now, as you may or may not know, the Palestinian state is currently divided into two countries, the Gaza Strip, which is held by the Hamas movement, and the West Bank, in which there is some kind of autonomy held by the Palestinian Authority. And traditionally, at least over the last 10 years or so, most of Palestinian violence comes out of the Gaza Strip by Hamas terrorists. This time, the vast majority of the attacks are coming out of the West Bank. Now, in times of crisis, a nation is quite different than a corporate brand. The Coca-Cola company does not have to comment on terrorist attacks. It does not have to comment on climate change. It does not necessarily have to comment on events taking place in real time. That cannot be said of a country. A country has to react to events taking place around the world, and especially to events taking place in that country. Now, a country has especially a duty to respond to crises, especially crises happening in that country. And what really characterizes crises is that they evolve quite rapidly, and that crisis communications becomes reactive rather than proactive. You comment on events as they take place instead of dictating the communications and media policy that you actually want to implement. So what happens is that during a crisis you have to create a narrative, but you also have to integrate that narrative into your national brand. Otherwise you can't stay on message. And countries such as Israel that continuously comment on events as they take place would have a very hard time having nation branding campaigns if they consistently got off message and had to be reactive to events that are taking place. So the two questions about nation branding in times of crisis is, first, how do you stay on message? And secondly, how can the crisis be integrated into the national selfie? And Israel started to think a while ago, how are we going to respond to all these violent attacks by Palestinian terrorists while staying on message, while incorporating them into the national brand? And they quickly came to the realization that it has nothing to do with the startup nation, and it can't really have anything to do with Tel Aviv, because these attacks are happening all over Israel and not in one city. And so they decided to integrate these attacks into the third pillar of Israel's national selfie, and that is Israel as the Middle East's only democracy. And so Israel is basically using social media, namely Twitter and Facebook, in order to integrate these attacks into the national brand by making the following assertions. 5 assertions. First, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and as such it is a bastion of liberal democracies. Second, there is no difference between the Palestinian Authority and the Hamas movement. Traditionally, Israel always stated that the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank might one day become a partner for peace, but that Israel has no intention of negotiating with the Hamas terrorist group. Now Israel says that there is no difference between these groups. It is actually lumping them together. Third, just as ISIS targets European countries, so Palestinian terrorists target Israel. They target Israel not because of its policies and not because of the occupation of the Palestinian people, but because of its liberal democratic nature. So Israel is facing what France, Belgium, and all other nations that have had terrorist attacks are facing. It's an attack on the morals and the values of democracy, not on Israeli policy. And finally, given that Israel is like all other democracies, Israel is at the forefront of a global war between light and darkness. And what I'd like to do over the next few minutes is to actually show you social media content, especially from Twitter, that has been published over the last few months that actually demonstrates how this narrative is built, and by so doing, how Palestinian terrorist attacks have been integrated into the national brand. So the first assumption, or the first assertion, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and it's a bastion of liberal democracy. And here we have a tweet published a few weeks ago by the Israeli mission to the UN in Geneva, saying over 1,000 people from 80+ organizations from all over Europe gathered to support Israel, #pro-democracy, anti-hypocrisy. So first of all, this comes to show that Israel is a democracy. It is a democracy that has global support, and that these people are tired of the UN hypocrisy. The hypocrisy being that Israel is routinely criticized in the UN, while not Palestinian terrorists. They quite seldom are attacked in the UN forums. Secondly, and this is from the Israeli Foreign Ministry, Israel is a democracy committed to the rule of law, forced to defend itself against Palestinian terrorists. And here again we have the basic claim. Israel is a democracy. Like all democracies, it is committed to the rule of law. And like all democracies, it now must defend itself against terrorist attacks. So we have here actually both parts of the claim. We have Palestinian terrorists, and they attack Israel not because of its policy, but because of its democratic nature. The second assertion, there is no difference between the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, and this tweet is representative of a lot of social media content published these days in which Hamas and the Palestinian Authority are lumped together. And this is a tweet from the Foreign Ministry quoting Prime Minister Netanyahu saying, "We are in the midst of a wave of terrorism, the result of mendacious incitement by Hamas and the PA." So both these groups are similar because both incite against Israel and both lead to terrorist attacks against Israel. And here we also have a tweet published by the spokesperson of the Israeli Prime Minister saying, "The Palestinian terrorist who perpetrated the shooting attack near Bet El, an Israeli settlement, was the bodyguard of the Palestinian Authority's chief prosecutor in Ramallah." Now this is interesting because usually when the Israeli Foreign Ministry tweets about terrorist attacks by Hamas, it says Hamas operatives, Hamas terrorists. It never identifies them by name or affiliation. And here specifically they do that. They say that the person who perpetrated this terrorist attack is part of the Palestinian Authority in order to show that just like Hamas, the Palestinian Authority is also dedicating efforts to attacking Israel. Third, just as ISIS targets European countries, so Islamist Palestinians target Israel. And actually this image I think is very powerful. On the one side you have the ISIL terrorists, and on the other side you have the Palestinian terrorists, with the quotation saying terror is terror is terror. So there is no difference between ISIS terrorists in the Middle East, ISIS terrorists attacking Belgium or France, and Palestinian terrorists attacking Israel. But this image can also be looked at a bit differently, because when we examine this image closely, we do not know the nationality of the man holding the knife on the left. He could be Iraqi, he could be Syrian, he could be from Libya, he could be French. We also don't know the religion of the man who is being executed. We might assume he's Christian, but he might also be a Sunni Muslim. He might even be a Buddhist. We don't really know. When we look at the right side of the picture, and this is of course a manufactured image, not like the image on the left, which is taken from actual footage released by ISIS, we know the nationality of the person holding the knife. He's wearing a kafia and he is supposed to resemble all Palestinians, while the person being attacked is obviously Jewish because we see his talit and the yarmulke. So this image is different from the image of ISIS, and there is here basically an attack that the Palestinian terrorists attack Israel also because of its religion. So there is also an element of religious war here. The next assertion, just as ISIS targets European countries, so Islamist Palestinian terrorists target Israel. And we have another comment by the spokesperson of the Prime Minister saying, like ISIS, Palestinian terror organizations indoctrinate kids to become suicide bombers. So we've had a tweet from the Foreign Ministry and a tweet from the spokesperson of the Prime Minister. Here's another tweet from the spokesperson of the Israeli Defense Forces saying, Hamas and ISIS both use tunnels. What else do they have in common? And here's another tweet by an Israeli diplomat saying, ISIS and Hamas both praise terror attacks in Israel. Islamist terror is a terror wherever it is, in Israel, Africa, or anywhere in the world. So actually what we see is that this campaign, this narrative that Israel is promoting, these assertions, are going out on all its social media channels. The Foreign Ministry is tweeting this narrative, the Prime Minister is tweeting this narrative, the Israeli Defense Forces is tweeting this narrative, and even Israeli diplomats around the world. The next assertion, Palestinian terrorists attack Israel not because of its policies, but because of its liberal and democratic nature. And here we have a quote by Prime Minister Netanyahu saying, Israel stands shoulder to shoulder with France in this common battle against militant Islamic terrorism. So the battle France has is exactly the similar as the battle Israel has. This is not a territorial dispute. This is not a political dispute. This is not the story of the Israeli occupation. Rather, it is the story of all liberal democracies combating terror nowadays. Oh, sorry. 1 second. And another tweet by Israel's ambassador to the UN saying the heinous murder of innocent Israelis just because they're Israelis is no different than the cruel massacre of innocents in France. And this came out a day after the attacks in Paris. So Israel is like France, it is like Belgium, it is fighting a shared and a common enemy. Finally, Israel is at the forefront of a global war between light and darkness. And these words matter. These words have a meaning. And we'll see that this is really the exact vernacular that is used on Israeli social media accounts. And here is one tweet. Islamic extremist elements are trying to set alight the capital of Israel. So Israel is the light while Islamic terrorists are the darkness. Prime Minister Netanyahu let us light a torch of truth and justice to safeguard our common future. The common future being that of all people from liberal democracies fighting off terrorism. And finally, we have here the moral issue. And these are tweets that are retweeted by the Israeli Foreign Ministry quite often, and they actually detail the amount of humanitarian aid delivered every day into the Gaza Strip by the State of Israel. So we have here a global battle between light and darkness, in which Israel is the light, and even its values are the light. As opposed to Islamic terrorists, it is delivering humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip. So what does Israel really gain by creating this narrative? Well, first of all, it incorporates events into the national brand. It stays on message. Instead of saying we condemn these violent attacks, instead of saying these violent attacks must stop, instead of saying we hold the Hamas group responsible for these attacks, Israel has created a narrative that is integrated into its national selfie. It is a democracy, and it is being attacked because it's a democracy. And it also creates a positive association between itself and other democracies around the world. So it's also able to influence the way it's perceived by other people. Israel is not an apartheid state. It's a liberal democracy. Israel is not like apartheid South Africa. It's like France and Belgium. Even more importantly, this narrative delegitimizes the Palestinian leadership and the Palestinian government, because it basically says Hamas is the Palestinian Authority. There are no moderate Palestinians left. They are all out to attack Israel, and they are all out to attack democracies. It also counters the Palestinian narratives. The Palestinian narrative says that attacks are a response to the occupation, to the policies of Israel, and to the, I think, 4-year siege now on the Gaza Strip. But Israel is able to counter that narrative by saying, no, these attacks are part of a global wave of terror against democracies. So it's not a territorial dispute, it's a global war, and Israel might actually be creating a base for legitimizing its use of power, because when the next Israeli military operation comes, it will supposedly be justified, because it is fighting for democracies, because it is fighting for Western liberal enlightened values. How is this unique? It's unique because traditionally when we talk about social media and extremism, we talk about how extremist networks and groups use social media. And indeed, social media has been used by extremist groups for nearly 2 decades now. Al-Qaeda used the internet, forums, web chats, whatever comes to mind, in order to spread its grand narrative of how it was going to liberate the Muslim world from the clinches of America. And as far back as 2008, it was it's estimated that 80% of recruitments to jihadi groups are done via social media and the internet. Nowadays, ISIS content is spread by nearly 14,000 tweets a day, and ISIS manages a social media empire throughout the world. And many of the efforts from nations have been to combat extremism online. So the United States has a department within the State Department, or a unit within the State Department, that is meant to counter extremist narratives online and try to interact with people that are susceptible to recruitment by ISIS. Israel's case study is quite different, because Israel actually is using social media to brand others as ISIS extremists. It's saying that the Palestinian terrorists, the Palestinian government, the Palestinian Authority is just like ISIS. And so it is actually doing here a kind of symbolic, violent gesture in which it is branding the Palestinian government as ISIS terrorists. So it's not combating online extremism. It's actually using elements from online extremism to brand another government. And it is creating an associative link between Palestinian terrorists and ISIS terrorists in order to ignore the territorial and historical elements of the conflict. Now, an important question is, does this work, and on who? Does this image evoke certain feelings, or does it lead to a conclusion by people that Israel is really like France and Belgium, or is it just meant to preach to the choir? Well, this is a very interesting question, but it's quite possible that Europeans who are critical of Israel, critical of its policies, critical of the occupation of the Palestinian people, will not view this as material that actually influences their judgment. They won't actually accept this equation between ISIL and Palestinian terrorists. But it's also possible that they're not the true target audience of this campaign. It's quite possible that Israel uses this social media campaign in order to galvanize people who already support Israel, strengthen its traditional base of supporters, and appeal to the global Jewish diaspora that is an important element in Israel's foreign policy. And this is why it's possible that in this doctored picture, it's very clear that this is a Palestinian terrorist attacking a Jew because he's a Jew. And this is supposed to resonate with global Jews, with people who advocate for Israel around the world. And we also have to question if this actual narrative by Israel, if this new campaign, doesn't contribute to ISIS's global image. When we think about Al-Qaeda, the brand of Al-Qaeda was associated with tunnels in Afghanistan, with a network of silent cells, dormant cells, which was able to carry out attacks from hiding in little tunnels in Afghanistan. And it was actually withstanding the might of the United States by being low-tech, not necessarily high-tech. ISIS, the brand of ISIS is a little bit different. It's possible that ISIS brands itself as an omnipotent terror organization. It is able to strike everywhere, every time, whenever it chooses to do so. It can strike at every capital. It can strike even at the heart of European capitals when they are at their utmost vigilant. So does the Israeli narrative actually support this brand of ISIS by saying, yes, ISIS is the biggest terrorist group in the world, it's omnipotent, and it's even omnipotent amongst the Palestinians. It has actually taken over Palestinian terrorism. And that's about it, unless you have any questions. Thank you.